you, if you sound like the kind of person who might be interested in taking part in our programs and applying to us to be admitted as a mentor, then do follow us on our social media and subscribe to our newsletter. And our next application round will open in September for 2023. But it's been, I was saying to our guests right before we lifted the velvet curtain, that it's been quite interesting to watch the number of people who apply to us each year and say that they're interested in becoming science journalists, because that number is going up and up. And of course, for the last few years, as we've grappled with the pandemic, science journalism has become really in the focus of a lot of people's attention as we try and work out the next stage in the pandemic, its implications, as well as all the other issues to do with climate change and technological innovation. So I'm really looking forward to this event. If you have questions, please pop them in the chat box and we will make sure that they're brought to the attention of our panel tonight. But I'm going to pass over now to Hannah Devlin, the science correspondent of The Guardian, who's chairing this evening's event, and she in turn will introduce our panel. Thanks very much for joining us, and I hope you enjoy it. Thanks. Hannah.
Hi, and thanks everyone for joining us for this masterclass on how to be a science journalist. As you've heard, I'm Hannah Devlin, I'm science correspondent at The Guardian, and I'm joined this evening by three fantastic panelists. Have David Shukman. David was BBC News' first science editor from 2012 to 2021 and is now visiting professor in practice at the LSE's Grantham Institute. A pioneer of live broadcasting from remote locations from the Amazon to Antarctica, David's won awards for highlighting the scale of planetary change. And in his sign-off from the BBC, he said, along with feeling despair at the damage that extreme weather is causing to the most vulnerable people, I'm also inspired by a new level of engagement, a surge of clever innovations, and a younger generation mobilised and determined to find a way through. I'm also joined by Thomas Morris. Thomas is science correspondent at Sky News, covering COVID, space, climate change, and everything in between. He won a BAFTA for his reporting on the Ebola epidemic and a series of awards for his documentaries, including the Press Association Award for Environmental Storytelling and the Prince Rainier Special Prize at the Monte Carlo TV Festival. And lastly, I'm joined by Shivani Dave. And Shivani is a journalist, broadcaster and physicist, and they present music radio shows on Virgin Radio Chilled and news coverage via Openly News on TikTok for the Thomson Reuters Foundation. Shivani is also a producer for the award-winning independent LGBTQ history podcast, The Logbooks, and is in the Radio Academy's 30 Under 30. So thanks to all of you for joining us. And I wanted to start by asking each of you, fairly briefly, if you can, how you got into science journalism, and perhaps if there's any advice that you can offer based on the route that you took into science journalism. Maybe we can begin with David, I think is our veteran.
Oh, thanks, Hannah. I mean, like with so many things, it was unplanned. It was a kind of accident, really. I'd been reporting on all kinds of different things through the 80s and 90s, including some conflicts. And I was a general reporter, and I was covering defense, military affairs and diplomacy. And there came a moment when I realized I didn't want to do any more conflict. And so that was a bit of a personal kind of Rubicon to cross and admit to editors that actually I don't want to do that anymore. So a terrific, kindly editor cast around for something else for me to do. And he came up with this job of, do you want to be science and environment correspondent aimed at the 10 o'clock news? And initially I thought, well, I don't kind of know what that is. Is it labs? What? I mean, that sounded a bit too tame, actually. And various people said, you know, that's a terrific job, go for it. And one editor said, what I want from you is anything that you would see on the cover of National Geographic or imagine seeing there. I want space, I want rainforests, I want whales, I want ice, volcanoes, just give me all of that. And so, of course, I took the job, and it was amazing. And I think coming into science journalism, having been a general reporter, you might think, well, that's no preparation. And of course, I got criticized really a lot by people who said, well, you're not a proper scientist. What do you know? But actually, as a general reporter, you have to acquire some skills. You have to know what questions to ask. You've got to do your homework. You've got to check whether people are telling you the truth. You do your own common sense evaluation of a line, an angle, and try to make sense of it and try to broadcast it in a way that actually people will understand. You're kind of an interpreter of science to a wider audience. So very quickly, I found I loved it. And of all the different jobs I've done, it's been the best by miles.
Thanks. So, and sorry, I just have to correct Thomas. I'm very sorry for introducing you as Thomas Morris. My notes were incorrect. And David, I think there's loads there that I want to come back to, but maybe we can go on to Thomas now and ask you the same question.
So I came up through the specialist route all the way from university. I wanted to be a cancer researcher. I was doing genetics, but then I got my head turned by getting involved with a student newspaper where I was the science editor. First job out of university was going into a health magazine. It was a weekly magazine newspaper for GPs. And that really gave me some fantastic grounding in what being a journalist really was. And then by chance, this job came up. It was actually the Daily Mail were starting the first foray into cable TV back in the day. And it didn't last long, but it lasted long enough to get me that first job in TV. And that was a stepping stone to Sky, where I've now been for, more than 2 decades, first as the health correspondent. And then it became, after about 17 years, it became apparent that the really exciting stuff was going on in a specialism that didn't exist at Sky at the time, and that was science. And so I gradually started this land grab, doing more and more science stories. And eventually, when we started doing this plastics campaign, it became apparent that I couldn't do that as well as health. So I became the full-time science correspondent, and it is the best job in the business. I absolutely love what I'm doing. And I never believed that I would have gone to Kazakhstan to see a rocket launch, gone to, Antarctic and the Arctic and various tropical islands. I mean, it's just been an extraordinary job. And one of the brilliant things about TV is that you've got to go to places to show people what the story's all about.
Thanks a lot. That's really interesting. And I find it so interesting how different people have sort of converged on this job through such different routes. Shivani, I know that you've got a science background too, but what took you from studying physics into a media job?
Firstly, I just want to say that I cannot wait for my trip to the Antarctic and Arctic, because that's yet to come for me. I think what I found was I was studying physics and I loved it, but I realized that I loved so much more than what I was learning about in my lectures and things like that. It was the fact that it felt like I was at a fork in the road. I would either specialize very heavily in one area of physics, or I would be able to share my passion of physics, but more generally other areas of science with people more generally. I was involved in the Student Radio Association or Society, or whatever it's called at university, and I was part of a news program, and I would always bring science stories to the table and find what sort of really got me passionate was finding ways to talk about something that would be quite complex, or things people wouldn't really look at or try and understand, and bring that to them in a way that they found they were having a 15-minute discussion about this thing that they probably previously wouldn't have ever thought about twice. And that to me really inspired me, and I love talking. So it felt like a very natural place for me to go to managed to pursue all of my passion across the fields, different fields within science and health and environment, but also to be able to keep talking.
And can you say a little bit more about how you got into, sort of what your job is now and how you got into that? Because I think it's nice to hear from, someone who's maybe doing a less traditional sort of science journalism job, and you've done sort of a mix of different things.
Yeah. So after I graduated, I did a master's in science media production, partly because I knew that this was a route that I wanted to go down, and partly because I had no idea how to get down that route, because it's not something that you're traditionally taught in a science degree. Mostly they're preparing you for working in industry, or working in a PhD or something like that. So I took a year to try and learn the skills of the trade and the craft, and ended up applying for 1,000 jobs, and I only got one, and it happened to be at the BBC as a sort of general news reporter across the World Service in Radio 4. And what sort of stood out to the person who was interviewing me at the time was the fact that I have a science background, and I've got a slightly different experience of the world when you compare yourself to lots of English and classics graduates who end up being journalists, which is changing, but still there is this imbalance that we see. And so I was sort of a general news reporter, and I reported on lots of things, but one of those things was science, and I really pushed to be able to do science stories, constantly pitching science stories. And it meant that I was reporting across a number of different outlets as well as the ones that I'd sort of been hired to work on. And I then decided to take a step back from the BBC and experience a freelance life, which is something that seems to be more and more common for people my age, at least. And utilize the skills that I had at the BBC to sort of pitch myself to places. So I've worked with the Guardian Science Weekly podcast, presenting and producing some of the podcasts for them over 2021. I think everything I do, every story I look at, I do look at from quite an analytical, sciencey angle. So I'm looking at a story regarding the BAFTAs, which is something that I might report on, or something I might talk about for my show on Virgin Radio. But I'm looking at it from a scientific angle a lot of the time, thinking about, now COVID, obviously, but also thinking about environmental costs and things like when the Treasury released their NFT, lots of people were sort of saying, how cool is this? And I was like, how much is this going to cost us in terms of the planet? And I try and look at everything from that angle, because it's sort of something that I can't take out of myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, just to mention, I think maybe we're an unrepresentative panel in that three of us. I've got a science background too, but I think from science journalists I know that's perhaps not representative, and I know far more people that have come from non-science backgrounds, and I sometimes feel myself, I don't know, I think maybe having a slightly analytical way of looking at things can be helpful, but I don't think a science background, I wouldn't want to give the impression that it's a prerequisite in any way at all. But I wondered what you think about whether there are particular skills that are important, not necessarily uniquely for science journalism, but that are particularly important for covering science topics. I know, David, you said, you learn the skills of a journalist doing general reporting. Maybe come to you were there new skills that you had to learn when you moved into covering science?
Well, look, I think the fundamental one is just to have an underlying curiosity about the world. I mean, that's a driver for most journalists. We tend to, if you're somewhere and there's a door marked private, we kind of tend to want to have a look in, don't we? If there's a bit of tape blocking us from going somewhere, we kind of want to hop over, don't we? I mean, that's kind of who we are. It's actually the mindset that many scientists have. They just want to frame questions to try to get to answers about the world around us. You know, why is the sky blue? What is going on with greenhouse gases? Why exactly is the ice melting? Is it the oceans or the air or whatever? I mean, you know, there's a kind of passion and a curiosity, I think. And I think to go with that, and Shivani has touched on this really nicely, is a determination to explain. And I think that has to be something that you're just really, really eager to do. And if you bring that to the job, because I think if you can't explain what you're reporting on really clearly, there's no point doing it. And I think that particularly applies with science. You know, I think we sometimes, you know, you do find people who sort of say, oh, science, that's so difficult, I don't like the word and puts me off. Then there's a whole crowd of people who really want to know what's going on and will read Stephen Hawking's works and you know, listen to Brian Cox's programs, and they're passionate about what science can do for us and tell us. But when the explanations start, very often they hit a wall of comprehension and have trouble getting through that. And I think the job of a science journalist is help them punch through. I mean, we had a debate, some people may remember the astonishing confirmation of the discovery of gravitational waves. Right now, you try selling that in the newsroom, 6 o'clock news, gravitation, what the hell that, you know, and you say, look, Einstein theorized that these things would exist 100 years ago. Now they've actually found them. And the temptation I could see in the eyes of the editor of the News at 6 was, it's not really on for us. That's not for us. And with colleagues, we just bulldozed them and said, this is huge, and found the language to explain why. It ended up leading the 6 o'clock news and News at 10 that night. And I'm very proud of having had a hand with others in making that happen. And we could then say, this is why it matters. And you know, the greatest moment that day was getting ready to do a live in the studio for News at 10. And the person doing the makeup for anyone making a studio appearance said, oh, I saw your report on the 6 o'clock news. That's really interesting. I hadn't realized about that. You helped me understand it. And you think, oh, that's it. If you could get one person to understand some really fascinating bit of science, I think that has to be the prime motivation for wanting to be a science journalist.
I agree with everything David said there, and it is about communicating that wonder that we all have about the world around us, the biology, the chemistry, the physics. I think the recent 2 years, though, Hannah, with COVID, and you know, you must have felt it too. There was an absolute tidal wave of information coming our way, and you needed, because there was no commentary that came with it, you were in effect having to judge evidence yourself. So all those preprints where there'd been no peer review by other scientific colleagues, they were just being dumped overnight onto these servers, and you were having to wade through it, trying to judge what evidence you should be taking seriously and reporting on. So I think the last 2 years show that you do need to know your way around a scientific paper. That doesn't mean you necessarily have to have a science background, but you do need to understand what a statistical significance is to understand whether the conclusions actually stand up.
There was a great bit of guidance given to me by my colleague Pallab Ghosh when I started many, many years ago. He said, look, watch out for an overexcited press release that claims to have cured cancer. And then you read down into the small print and you realize they did a study on 2 mice over a long weekend, right? And so, you know, with or without peer review, you know, that there's something, it's very satisfying actually, but yeah, I think Tom is right. You've got to do your own evaluation. You've got to have the skill set to be able to judge how plausible is this? How big a sample, over what period of time? Is it 10,000 people over 20 years? You know, who's involved? What kind of journal has published it? But you're right, COVID really did produce a challenge on that front because you were having to make your own judgment. Is this worth it?
I think, as well as what both Thomas and David have said, what's really important is being able to, to add to the factor of having to be able to decipher what is being put in front of you and having to understand that and do a little bit more research as to what's actually going on as opposed to what's being said in a press release, is also the fact that you have to make sure that you as a science journalist approach things with some of the core skills of what journalists should all have, which is to make sure that you're not sort of confirming your own biases, because you can find one paper that will confirm what you think, you know, whatever that might be. That the earth is flat. You'll find another paper that says that the earth is round. Obviously you want to go with what we know to be true and what is more sort of backed up by science. And I think one thing that science journalists or people who want to talk about science struggle with is the fact that they want to have the 100% definite answer all the time, because I think in layman's terms, we sort of think that science will provide a black and white yes or no answer. And most of the scientists I've spoken to ever will tell you that it's always more complicated than yes or no, right or wrong, black and white. And there are thousands of degrees of shades of grey. And it's sort of your job as the science journalist to understand that and represent that in the most clear, most balanced way.
And my goodness, the last 2 years really highlight that just the multiple interpretations of the evidence. You know, just face masks. You know, there are so many different schools of thought on how effective they were, and you know, all these things. I think it's just there is no one science, definitely.
Yeah, I was going to come in there and say, I mean, the other thing that's been really apparent in the past 2 years is the fact that scientists are, you know, they have political views, and they have huge disagreements with each other, and that's been another thing I think to navigate in the pandemic, the disagreements within the scientific community, and which, you know, completely highlight the point you're making, Shivani, that it's not that science has a sort of single authoritative voice that can answer some of these questions. There's often disagreements, and I guess that's something yeah, that you have to navigate as a journalist, of how to represent those different views and figure out what people's motivations are.
I think it's probably also
I'm interested in asking sort of more generally how COVID has changed science journalism, and whether you know, you sort of found yourself in a new level of prominence in the sort of evening news. I think it's been a pretty intense time for most science journalists, and maybe if your team has expanded as well. I know that's probably something people who are thinking of getting into science journalism will be interested in.
I mean, yes, certainly in the BBC, most of us in the science team kind of joined the health team, who'd been leading on the coverage. It soon became clear that there were kind of millions of scientific questions that we could help with. I mean, like masks, asymptomatic transmission, which came up again today in that High Court case with the care homes, a whole host of sort of unanswered questions, really. And I think, in a way, it was awful to talk about a silver lining, but I mean, what kind of one interesting facet of all of that was we had to, back to Shivani's point, you know, in a way we had to share with audiences scientific uncertainty. You know, that this is the frontier, and you know, these scientists think this may be the case, but they're waiting for more data. Another crowd have a different perspective. You know, I think as time went on, I think it was important to be, as with, for example, climate change, important to be able to say, where does the kind of weight of scientific consensus land? You know, there may be a million different perspectives on sea level rise or what climate change is doing to hurricanes, or heat waves. But I think we've got to be careful as science journalists not to confuse the audience about the basic direction of travel on something. You know, that you keep lobbing in more CO2 into the air and you get hotter conditions, and that leads to various outcomes. I think it's important, and as we did with COVID, I think reflect that there are internal debates. It's a journey with all the uncertainties that entails, but where possible, kind of indicate where things are heading in terms of evidence?
I think what really changed during the pandemic was the appetite for explainers and analysis. People really want to understand what lies behind the headlines. And that might have happened anyway, but the pandemic, I think, really accelerated what was happening, because every decision that was being made, every paper that was being published was really changing their lives. You know, we were all having to adapt our lives because of emerging evidence. So people wanted to understand how good was that evidence. So I think as science journalists, we were all involved in that, helping the public to understand what was being said in the daily briefings by, you know, Valence and whichever government minister being put up in the middle. So I think that was a real value that I think we gave to the public over the last 2 years.
And I think as well as that, what we found was the intersection of science and politics in the last 2 years, which was huge. And, you know, you can argue as to whether or not it was politics that was leading on some of the decisions made by the government, or if it was actually the science that was, you know, as they kept saying, they were led by the science. You can argue which way you believe that was going at different points during the pandemic. And it was a point where I think it really showed the importance of science journalism and science journalists to work in a larger team to be able to provide that sort of analysis and explanation of what was happening, for example, around the time when everyone was eating out to help out, if the risks actually were lower, as some claims were, or if you know, this was a decision that was taking a calculated risk in order to try and help the economy. And working as part of a larger team, not necessarily full of people who are science journalists or people from science backgrounds, but who have that insight from a political, economic aspect or a social aspect, was really valuable.
I wanted to just briefly ask as well, your sort of people that, you know, people will have seen your faces on TV and heard your show, Shivani, but presumably you have producers working with you. There are other roles for science journalism within your teams. I mean, in my job, it's basically, you know, we're just a small team of reporters, and you know, we have editors, but in terms of the science journalism team, it's pretty small. But I'm interested in, for you know, BBC and Sky, and also on the radio, are there sort of more roles that people should be thinking about if they're interested in getting into science journalism? I can see Thomas nodding.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, our team has grown a lot over the last few years. As I said, I kind of invented the science role at Sky, but it has grown since. You know, there is now a climate correspondent, another person doing science, there's a technology correspondent, and then there's a science news editor. Each of the TV correspondents has a producer working with them. And then there's also a technology editor on the website, and so it is a growing team that I think people are always amazed when they walk into the newsroom just how many people are there doing jobs that they had never imagined. Sky's been really driving at new platforms. TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, we all have, and podcasts too, another rapidly growing area. And there are people working on all those areas. And I think that's really exciting to see young people who are digital natives coming in and just really pushing these new platforms forward in a way that, you know, people who've just been in television for a long time probably wouldn't.
I definitely endorse that. I mean, you know, certainly in TV, and in fact, most of the work, nothing happens without the team. You know, there are colleagues that you won't see their name on the website, but behind the scenes actually making it all happen. And what I've always enjoyed is quite vigorous debates sort of with colleagues about whether it's a story, some new development. Is it a story or not? How are we going to do it? What's the best way? And you can have those. I mean, it was harder with lockdown when we were all working separately, but I suppose we would do it on Zoom. But just having kind of quite enthusiastic, often vigorous, sometimes spirited arguments about, you know, whether to do a certain story, how to do it, if we do it a certain way with particular graphics, will that help or hinder understanding? Who should the interviewees be? Which scientists? I mean, all of that actually is a wonderfully creative, productive process. And the result is always massively better than if it was one person, like the person presenting the report, going on their own. And it's absolutely a sort of magical thing to be part of. And so definitely, Hannah, yeah, if there are people who are interested in production roles, research roles, you know, writing, maybe for the website, but maybe not doing other aspects of broadcasting, all of that's available. And the nice thing is a highly collaborative team, and everybody helping each other. And that's a really exciting thing to be part of.
For sure. I work across lots of different organizations, and so there will be periods of time where I will have editors and producers, or not necessarily producers working specifically with me, but producers on other bits of output. And I think one of the best things about working in sort of an open pan collaborative news space is the fact that you get to have that creative bouncing ideas, bouncing different wording around with somebody to discuss those things. But then some of the other work that I do, for example, being on social media and being able to find that knack on TikTok in particular at the moment is incredible. If you are someone who is just trying to put, you know, your journalism out there, that is me in my living room with this ring light and just sort of trying to make sense of things for people. And those are actually the videos that do really well when I'm trying to be funny and lip sync to a song. Nobody cares, but people really do value that that way of communicating that is authentic and that is understandable. And you know, with doing that, with putting things like that on social media, I'm doing the role of, you know, a camera person and lighting and filming. I'm doing the scripting, I'm doing the editing, I'm sort of doing all the research. So in a normal sort of news environment, all of those jobs, or, you know, many of those jobs would be split up between different people, and you can sort of have a go at all of the different elements yourself from home, which I really like about the fact that, you know, there's so much access to being able to broadcast from your living room now.
I think that is a massive opportunity for anybody who's wanting to come into science journalism, is to use these new social media channels, particularly TikTok, where you're learning so many new skills. And you're absolutely acquiring people who will follow you, but also it's a fantastic advertising space for any media execs out there who are looking for a distinctive voice, a fresh face, somebody who can really communicate and engage with people that traditional television finds difficulty with. You know, young people are really difficult. They're not watching mainstream TV in the same way. So if you are able to communicate with them in a way that really engages them, I think that's going to get noticed. It's a really great way into the profession now.
Yeah,
I think
I'm really impressed by that.
Can I just quickly remind people, if anyone has questions, you're very welcome. We'd encourage you to just put them in the chat on the Zoom if you'd like to ask anything. I wanted to ask Shivani, I think there are particular types of stories that work maybe better for print, and others for, you know, broadcasts obviously need to have images and you know, something to show to go with the story. I'm interested in your perspective. Are there particular types of stories or things that you look at in the way you present things on TikTok, or, you know, putting things on social media that work particularly well? I'm just maybe thinking of people who want to try it out themselves and try and put science content on these platforms. Is there, you know, are there particular things that you think work especially well on those platforms?
Yeah, I think first of all, I'm fully here for the science social media takeover. Everyone puts science content on Twitter and Instagram and TikTok, and let's take over all of social media with science. I think first and foremost, you need to understand each of the platforms and what they're looking for and how they work. So, you know, understanding that Twitter works really well if you've got some text, maybe in a thread, and maybe some images. If you're going to put a video on there, you need to know that videos aren't going to be able to last more than 2 minutes or 2 minutes 20. So you have to understand the constraints of the different platforms and what works well, what the algorithm likes, specifically with TikTok, because I think that is sort of the emerging social media that lots of people want to try and use but don't know how to, or maybe slightly scared of, is it really values authenticity from the creator or the journalist in this case. And so in terms of what I would choose to put on there would be something that I am genuinely interested or genuinely fascinated by, something where you can see in my face or you can see in how I'm expressing myself that there is something to get excited about. I think that is what keeps people watching, because people have this short attention span where they will just scroll to the next video if they're not maintaining interest. And so just a story that you're really passionate about, that sort of gets to the point. TikTok again favors shorter videos, but this is what I really like about it, the fact that you've got this space to be really creative, to use sort of things like trending sounds, or to use funny little bits of audio in a way that people you would never see on a traditional news broadcast. You would never see someone on the BBC sort of running into a room pretending they're screaming, talking about climate change with a few words popping up on the screen, and then sort of dancing with a filter over themselves with some sort of happier news about whatever's going on. That would never happen, but it's a place where you can get creative and find different ways to share a story, which I really love. And it's always a challenge, and not everything's going to work well. But when you get that one viral video, you're kind of like, someone's paying attention.
Yeah, I think it's important not to dumb down though on TikTok, isn't it? I mean, I think some perhaps traditional media were quite sniffy about TikTok at first, but certainly from the growth that we've seen on TikTok over the last 6 months, 12 months, there's a huge appetite for news that is just as hard hitting on TikTok as it is on other perhaps more traditional platforms. Yeah,
I would definitely agree with that. People, the audience is younger. The audience is the audience that, traditional broadcasters like Sky and the BBC are trying to chase, but are not getting. So going to this audience and still providing them with that factual content that is engaging, informative, educational, but doing it in a language that they understand. I think this is a big part of what it means to be a science journalist as well. Being able to translate language from a research paper into speak that people understand is a big part of the job. And I think this is another sort of translation that we're doing, where it's taking the scientific research and translating that into a method of communication that people who are users of TikTok understand.
And my goodness me, the last 2 years
applies everywhere, doesn't it? Sorry, Thomas.
Yes, go ahead.
I think that translation role is just fundamental to whoever you're talking to. If you're pitching to an editor, or if you're going on air, if you can't find the way to explain it, people are going to just tune out. And I think it's so interesting to hear you talk about that in relation to TikTok. I mean, obviously, you've got the time constraint there is even greater than it might be on the news. So in a way, you've got to work harder. I think that's a message I'd like to bring out of this. Is that I think to be an effective science journalist, you have to do behind the scenes quite a bit of homework so that you really understand the story, don't you? I think you can't shortchange on reading the paper, ringing around, getting a good sense in your head about what this amounts to, and then doing your translation and finding the words that resonate with people.
And in terms of finding stories, do you all find social media helpful for that too? I found it, picked up an incredible number of tips on there over the years. I'm sure that must be similar for for all of you?
I think that was certainly the case with COVID, because you just had this, as Thomas has said, this sort of tsunami of research and scientific opinion and news developments all over the world, any one of which or all together could sort of make a story. And I think that in a way it was quite overwhelming, actually. There were times when it was just very hard. You know, you thought you were keeping across a lot of stuff, and then someone would say, well, you have seen this, haven't you, about wherever? And you think, well, no, I haven't, because I was reading all this stuff over here. So that was, I think it made sort of, you know, trying to be a good judge, an accurate judge of what was significant, really, really challenging, but valuable.
Yeah, there was an element of due diligence that you need to employ as well, though. But once back in the day when I first started off, you know, you got your weekly Lancet, Nature, you know, the science journals, and that's where the stories, many of the stories were. And then with COVID, you saw the preprints, and then people started putting threads on Twitter. And I think you really need to be quite careful, because there had been no filter often on what people were putting onto Twitter, and there were people making various, I mean, you can just herd immunity, for example, the debate over that, and some people were making some very strong claims based on not very strong evidence. So I think there was an element, you needed to be extremely cautious before you leapt on stuff on social media.
I think
Okay,
particularly
maybe just on that point, we've got a question from Lisa on how much of your job becomes fact checking, especially during COVID, due to this sort of influx of information. And I think you mentioned that, Thomas. I'm wondering sort of how much of you've got to be, you know, pitching a story, preparing a report, but then also at the same time kind of figuring out how confident you are about the information. Is that something that you'd spend a lot of time?
Well, I think particularly if doing a piece for television, there's a huge resource commitment very early in the day. From some of the people that you know, we've been talking about, the producers, the camera crews, and the editors that would be assigned to getting a piece onto the evening news. So you're having to make a judgment really early on, perhaps even before you've had a chance to put it to another scientist to say, well, what do you think? Because all the editorial meetings are in the morning, and I think you're basing anything you say on the knowledge you've built up in the weeks that have ticked by in the pandemic. I think you do need to be cautious, and that there is a point where it's as important to tell the news desk, I don't think we should do this story, as there is in saying, look, this is a brilliant story that we should be doing. I think that's the kind of judgment that our audiences would expect. It's about trust and evidence.
It can be frustrating, can't it? I mean, you can spend quite a lot of time working out that the story isn't worth pursuing, you know, and no one kind of thanks you for it, you know.
But that's equally important in journalism, especially with science journalism. Yeah, to know when to say, actually, this story is not.
Doesn't stack up.
Yeah. And I think going back to the social media element and the fact checking stuff during COVID, what I saw a lot of on social media was confusion. I remember there was a period of time when lots of people were talking about how the COVID vaccines were affecting their menstruation, and that was a thing that was sweeping social media, and everybody who you know wouldn't classify themselves as an anti-vaxxer, and I've got strong views on whether or not we should be calling people anti-vaxxers based on sort of how things unfolded during the pandemic, but there was a lot of conversation about this, and people were quite rightly, you know, concerned, because it was something that hadn't really been discussed prior to getting the vaccine and people actually finding this out for themselves. And part of what I do on social media is also to see what those discussions are and to see what people outside the scientific community are saying about things and understand the questions that they want and they need answered. So we then, with Science Weekly, worked on a podcast episode about what was actually happening, and there was actually some research going on. So we spoke to the researchers and we tried to explain to people that, you know, with an immuno response to something, that might affect your period, but it was something that you know, Catherine Ryan was putting on her Instagram stories like, they didn't tell us this, and now this is all messed up. And like, I feel like that's a really important role, to be in the circles outside of the scientific community and to understand what people need answers for, that we can provide answers with science, with science.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting balance, isn't it? Because you want to be close enough to the scientific world to have trusted contact, so you can ring up in a hurry and say, hey, what's going on? What's all this about? I'm on air in 10 minutes kind of thing. But without getting sort of too cozy, because really you're representing the interests of the audience.
No one said it would be
There's a
easy,
balance.
David.
Say again?
No one said it would be easy.
No. I know.
I've got a good question here from Carol, who says, what do you think is the best way to empower people so they can deal with the fright and doom of climate change? And I guess that also applies to COVID, but make a difference in their lives, especially with the rise in the cost of living. I'm just interested in that question about, sometimes some of the news that science covers, not all, but some of it can seem a bit doom and gloom, and whether is it the role of a science journalist to kind of help people deal with the news that you're delivering, or you know, maybe it's a question of also covering subjects that are more awe-inspiring and just kind of generally positive. I'm interested in what your thoughts are on that.
I think
maybe Shivani, because you talked a little bit about that before when you mentioned climate change.
Yeah, I think when it comes to climate change, again, it's been a slower burn, but it is similar to what we saw with COVID, where it was a crossover. It is a crossover of science and politics. I think there are lots of science or lots of sort of things that I've seen and that I've read that puts a lot of the ownership of the climate crisis on the individual person, and a lot of the time, you know, statistically, is the individual going to make the biggest impact, or is that going to be, you know, a more structural governmental change? And I think it's the role of a science journalist to understand that and balance those things. Like when we were looking at sort of plastic straws that now have vanished from the face of the earth, or actually they're all in the sea, but when we were looking at plastic straws, yes, there is a certain ownership on the individual, but there is also something much larger at play when it comes to the climate crisis. And often people want to say, oh, it's this and this is the one solution. And I think what we've discussed in this already is the fact that science journalism isn't going to provide you with the one solution, but it's a very careful line to tread for a science journalist to make sure that you're providing a scientific analysis and explanation of what is happening, but also a political explanation or a political analysis of what is also going on. Because when it comes to the climate crisis, they are both so interwoven that it's almost impossible to separate them without making it seem like there's sort of one answer that will fix everything. And, you know, 5-10 years ago, it was plastic straws, getting rid of them. That would be the answer. Obviously, we know that's not the case.
I think, yeah, this is sort of grown as a theme, hasn't it, recently, you know, whether there's sort of too much doom and gloom in some of the stuff. I mean, one answer to that, I think, is we shouldn't do too much soft soaping. I mean, the planet is really in trouble. I mean, we are messing things up. I mean, Thomas's reports from different parts of the world, I've seen it for myself, you know, rivers choked with plastic, Greenland losing staggering amounts of ice, some of the poorest, most vulnerable countries like Bangladesh, you know, people on the coast there really, really facing hardship because of our use of growing use of fossil fuels. I mean, you know, these are, I think we shouldn't shy away from that. But at the same time, I think in the course of coverage, it's important also to look for signs of hope. You know, if there are clever innovations coming through the, you know, like renewable energy, if there's more and more information about the climate benefits of a change in diet, and I think some of these things, as they become more plausible, as the clean tech becomes more plausible, lower in cost, as we know more about the impact of beef from the Amazon or whatever, I think it's empowering. And I think that may be a way forward on this. I mean, that you actually give people a sense of agency, that actually, of course, one person is not going to take one action that's going to make all the difference. But I think the more people are aware of all the choices they can make about where they get their power, what they choose to eat, how they get around, and all the rest of it, I think that is an answer to the risk of all of this reporting being too depressing.
And I also think that certainly what happened before the pandemic, the rise of Extinction Rebellion and the Friday marches by students, I think that was a movement that grew from the ground up but put pressure on politicians. And I think when people do understand what is happening to the world around them, that is a force that politicians can't ignore. And I think that has definitely helped the dialogue on net zero. There's no way a politician is going to push through policies which are going to cost the economy more unless they felt that they were going to feel it the next election.
Thanks. I think we're coming towards the end of the session, but I wanted to ask, there's a question from Connor on what advice would you have for someone finishing a journalism degree and wants to get into the industry, and maybe try and make it as practical as possible. So if you were finishing your degree this year, what's the first thing you should do, and would you recommend going into science journalism?
Just do whatever Shivani does. I mean, I don't know about Thomas, but my route was so traditional: local paper, BBC trainee, blah blah blah. That's just, I think that's not the way to go. I think whatever Shivani's done is what they want to do. Connor.
Recording in progress.
I would agree with that totally. I think there was a period when it was just people who got postgrads in journalism who came into broadcasting, and I think that's changing. We're being much more creative in where we look for brilliant new talent now, and I think, as we said earlier, TikTok is a fantastic advertising space for those talents.
I think I was going to say that there's no one route into the industry, so I think apply for literally every single thing you can, because at the end of the day, a salary is a beautiful thing, but it's such a time where we as young people are having to be more and more creative about how we work, particularly within the media industry, and science journalism falls within that. So try and do the stuff that you want to do anyway. Apply for jobs, apply for internships, build up your own portfolio, show that you can put the work in, that you can do the work. And yes, obviously you're not going to be the finished product having just graduated, especially when you're sort of comparing yourselves to veterans of the industry, but show that you have a willingness to do the work and you're keen to try and to learn and to keep growing in the area, and put forward what you can do. Meet people, email people, ask them for a coffee, ask them if they've got any, if you can get in touch with any editors and things like that. Ask them if they've got any opportunities for you to come freelance, pitch them stories, pitch them ideas. It's a really hard graft, which is why if you can get the salaried job, that is a jackpot. But there are plenty of ways into the industry, and I think finding the thing that works for you, if that is writing, then to write for a blog or to write for an online magazine or to write for a local paper, whoever will let you write for them, just start doing it and show that you can do it, is sort of the key thing.
And
yeah, just get a foot in the door.
Sorry.
Just get a foot in the door, I was going to say. I mean, there's been plenty of people who start off as runners in TV, and they end up being producers. Producers become correspondents, and that has been one way of into television. Don't think that you're going to necessarily, your first job is going to be a science journalist. It might be something completely different in the newsroom, but once you're in the newsroom, you know who to go and talk to with the ideas that Shivani's been talking about.
And I was saying, and this picks up from you, Shivani, that I think for someone in Connor's position, you know, finishing a degree now, I mean, having all the skills that you've described doing your TikToks, I mean, that's something that just wasn't available to someone like me at your age. That just wasn't a thing any of us thought about or knew about. And I think now, anyone trying to get into one of these jobs, the more comfortable they are with everything that you've described, you know, video editing and all the rest of it, the more comfortable they are, the more that's going to help.
Yeah, and I think that the skills definitely transfer. The more comfortable you are filming yourself on your phone for a TikTok, it's only going to mean that you're slightly more comfortable when you get put in front of a camera for the first time, if that's the thing that you want to do. And yeah, 100% agree with what Thomas was saying as well, to just try and get in. Like, I come from a family of accountants. Media is not like a thing that was by any means on the radar growing up, and didn't know anyone. And it's so much of it is just emailing people, trying to make connections, just saying, hey, I've got this idea. Will you sit with me for 5 minutes and hear it? Let's chat and see if there's a story there. And if there is, can I produce it for you, or can I work on it with you? Is a great way to sort of start those conversations off.
And I think a bit like resisting climate, you know, getting too downhearted about climate change, the advice I've always given my own kids as they've looked for work is, if you get a rejection, and you're bound to, everyone gets rejected at some point, right? It's funny, you said you had 1,000 applications, right? You know, but for every rejection, immediately send off 2 more applications, or reach out to 2 more people. Just double the number immediately, and it's actually very empowering.
I think that's fantastic advice, and I'd echo all of that. And I think, I mean, should also add things like mentoring schemes, and even just reaching out to a journalist or someone else who's doing journalism that you admire. You know, I've had lots of help from you know, more senior journalists along the way, as I'm sure we all have. And you know, often it's actually just really nice getting an email from someone who wants to do a job like the one you're doing and who likes what you're doing. And I think a lot of journalists are quite willing to help people who want to get into the profession. So I would also recommend to people just, you know, getting in touch. People are quite easy to contact generally. You know, also organisations like the John Schofield Trust doing great mentoring programs. It's really worth you know, thinking about those too.
One more thing as well is, if you ever go to an industry fair or an award ceremony or something where there's somebody who's got power to pay you to do some work, and they say, drop me an email, 100% drop them an email, send them some ideas, get in touch, keep that contact up, because the amount of times people will say, email me, and then you just don't do it, you're missing an open goal right there. So 100% follow through on all of those drop me an emails.
All right, I think that was some fantastic advice there. I think we're at our kind of time limit, so I'm going to wrap up. But thanks so much to all our panelists and to everyone who joined us this evening, and also for John Schofield Trust for hosting the event.
Thanks for the questions. Great to
Thank
chat.
you.
Good luck to everybody.
Thank you.
It's a great role. If you can get it, I'd recommend it.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you on behalf of the Trust to the whole panel for spending the time on this Wednesday evening. Just to mention as well, if there is anyone who wants to get into the sector and is kind of wondering how, obviously you've had whole bunch of insight this evening from our panelists, but the mentoring scheme for the John Schofield Trust applications will open in September for that. So look out, you potentially could be mentored by someone who's already established in the sector, and so keep an eye out for that. You can do that by probably the best way of kind of getting the most up-to-date information is following us on Twitter or joining our newsletter. So it's J Schofield Trust on Twitter for anyone. But yeah, thank you to the whole panel, and hope everyone enjoys their evening.
Great. Take care all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
See ya. Take care.